I am now convinced, beyond a doubt, that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in that line, this army must inevitably be reduced to one of other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse. Why Valley Forge? That was the question on the mind of Congress at the end of the third year of the American Revolution. The assembly governing the recently United States of America were reeling from their evacuation out of Philadelphia. After an ambitious plan to recapture the capital was thwarted in the Battle of Germantown, Commander-in-Chief George Washington weighed his options. Low on supplies, and the weather threatening to turn cold, another offensive was out of the question. He could move west to protect Congress now huddled up in York and Lancaster, but feared wintering a whole army in any city would strain the civilian population too great. Washington also did not want to allow the British a chance to establish additional posts across the Pennsylvania countryside. Washington's solution lay on a plateau 20 miles up the Schuylkill River from Philadelphia. The region was named Valley Forge for the Mountjoy Iron Forge, situated at the mouth of Valley Creek. The British had destroyed much of the forge's infrastructure earlier that year, but the topography was ideal for a defense. 2 lines of earthworks anchored by 5 redoubts secured the location from any potential attack, with hopes the region's farms could sustain the army a short while till the quartermaster and commissary departments could procure their necessary provisions. Congress was not keen on Washington's decision. The year prior, when the Continental Army found itself in even greater straits, Washington successfully organized a counterattack across the Delaware River and won 2 key battles. Now, when it possessed far greater numbers, it appeared the Continental Army was running away. Had Washington lost his nerve after the loss of Philadelphia? If one saw Valley Forge around Christmas of 1777, you would know that was not the case. A day before the army's arrival, Washington had ordered the establishment of wooden huts for shelter. He required that they be 14 by 16 foot, include a fireplace insulated by 18 inches of clay, that they could house up to a dozen enlisted men. As no sawmill was available to create planks for the roof, Washington offered $100 to anyone who could conceive a viable alternative. While a $12 award awaited the first squad per regiment to erect a standardized hut, eyewitness accounts and archaeology revealed they were of various designs. Northern soldiers favored saddle notches, which provided better insulation, while Southern soldiers used dovetails for their simplicity to carve. Some huts were moored on stone foundations, while others were dug out of the ground. The huts of commissioned officers were somewhat more secure. This reproduction portrays what the accommodations of Virginian officers may have appeared. We are now about to build huts for shelter this winter, expecting a few days to be comfortable. Though we have nothing to work with, axes are very scarce. We have but 1 dull axe to build a log hut. When it will be done knows not. A humble collector here is one human being.
Yes, I am indeed.
Typically, you'd have anywhere from 8 to 12 human beings in here at one point in time.
It'd be pretty crowded.
And archaeology reveals that many of the soldiers did not properly follow Washington's procedures. Just adjacent to us is a site of archaeology. They found footprints in these cabins. Some of them were only a quarter of the size of the intended footprint.
Yeah, you'd be just kind of on top of each other.
Yeah.
Crammed in, next to an open fireplace. What could go wrong?
Nothing.
Nothing.
How you feeling?
You know what? You put a blanket on this, it's not the most uncomfortable thing I've ever laid down on. I don't think I want to do it for months on end, but one night camping excursion, yeah, sure.
The problem is you're going to be here for 6 months.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Again, another dozen guys in here.
Yeah, also no thank you on that. Well, especially, what's worse, the bottom bunk or the top bunk?
Well, the bottom, you're going to be very close to the mud that's going to be pouring in, as thankfully, we're visiting on a very rainy day, so you can see what would have happened. What happens when you're on the top bunk?
Night terrors, you fall out and land face first in the mud.
Not to mention the roofing was not often plank because they had very scarce tools to build shingles. So often there's evidence they used sod as the roofing, which led to leakage.
Ah, fun stuff.
Yeah, it's fun
Also, I'm pretty sure submarines have more head clearance on their bunks.
That's saying something.
Yeah, that is saying something.
Some of the general officers would take up residence in the few farmhouses that dotted the landscape. Brigadier General James M. Varnum of Rhode Island rented this particular stone house, which belonged to David and Elizabeth Stevens, throughout his first months at Valley Forge. Inside this residence, the Stevens and their youngest son would have to go about their daily routine, while their home was a front office for handling the affairs of Connecticut and Rhode Island men, as well as 7 officers quartering in any nook available in the house. Over the hill from the Stevens was the home of Deborah Hughes, who rented property at the mouth of Valley Creek from her cousin, Isaac Potts, a partner in the Mountjoy Iron Forge. Washington would in turn rent from Hughes and convert the stone residence into the headquarters of the Continental Army. This meant that not only was the business of maintaining the encampment confined here, but the logistics of the whole army across the fledgling nation was hosted out of this house. Amongst the famed individuals who aided Washington here were Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette. But it's worth noting, 30% of the correspondence that left this house was likely written by Tench Tillman. Domestic affairs were handled by an eclectic group, from Washington's wife Martha to enslaved cooks such as Hannah Till. Keeping the operations protected were the general's lifeguard, who were encamped just a short distance from the house. It's within the Potts house along Valley Creek that Washington partook in one of his greatest battles, keeping the Continental Army alive. Washington arrived at Valley Forge contending with whispers of a conspiracy to remove him as commander-in-chief. The epicenter of this conspiracy was Thomas Conway. Conway, whose brigade performed admirably at Brandywine, was nevertheless disliked amongst the officer ranks in the Continental Army for his constant lust of a greater promotion. After a letter was reported to Washington in Conway's hand describing him as a weak general, Conway voluntarily resigned, only for Congress to appoint him as Inspector General for the recently reorganized Board of War. Its president was Horatio Gates, victor at the battles of Saratoga and rumored recipient of the weak general letter. It appeared a conspiracy to supersede Washington's command was in full swing, but in truth the so-called Conway cabal ended before anything can really happen. Although Washington would later claim no animosity existed between Conway, and if it did, it wouldn't impede his work, the truth is he and his staff stonewalled any input Conway tried to have on affairs at Valley Forge. No sooner had Conway arrived, he was gone, and any conspiracy collapsed. Washington was not the only one giving people the cold shoulder. Thomas Mifflin, the Continental Army's quartermaster general, had resigned his position in October of 1777. His reasons were complicated, but essentially was a pairing of mounting frustrations with Washington's war strategy and Congress's lack of assistance in procuring supplies. Wanting to maintain the core value of a limited government, the Continental Congress encouraged the states to carry the weight of supplying their respective units. The good-natured idea made supplying a unified army impossible, and drove Mifflin mad. It took a month before Congress accepted his resignation, but did so on the condition he would remain on until a replacement could be found. They even tried to sweeten the deal by appointing him to the Board of War. While Mifflin accepted his new post, he ghosted Congress on any further quartermaster matters. This falling out sent the Valley Forge encampment into a crisis. The image of thousands of soldiers freezing to death in steep banks of snow, while somehow also learning the art of war to become an army superior to the British, that's not the real Valley Forge. The winter of 1777-78 was typical of most in Pennsylvania, even today. A few snowstorms whose residue would soon be melted by rain and lukewarm temperatures. Very uncomfortable, but survivable, so as long as you have the right clothes. But coming off a series of battles, half the army appeared naked and barefoot. With the collapse of the quartermaster department, commissaries were unable to acquire the bare material to keep the army warm, let alone match the varying standards of each state which they had for their uniforms. The clothing situation proved so desperate that Washington began instructing the hospitals to log the articles a patient came in with. In the event of their death, those clothes would be redistributed back to the army.
For God's sake, if you can't give us anything else, give us linen, that we may be enabled to rescue our poor worthy fellows from the vermin which are now devouring them, and which has emaciated and reduced numbers exactly to answer the description of Shakespeare's apothecary. Some hundreds we thought prudent to deposit some 6 feet underground who die of a disorder called the measles, i.e. for want of clothing. The whole army at present are sick of the same disorder, but the Pennsylvania lines seem to be the most infected. General Anthony Wayne. And apparently the measles refers to the lack of clothing as being part of the ineffective clothier, General James Mease. It's all his fault.
All his fault.
All his fault.
As for foodstuff, it was present across the countryside, but just out of reach for the Continental Army. Reason being, farmers in the region were unwilling to part with their harvest. The Continental currency, which was of paper, was worthless due to rapid inflation since the war began. Trying to acquire bulk provisions was constrained by the fixed prices the Board of War levied to keep costs low on behalf of Congress. Even if Washington could be guaranteed an endless source of supplies, where was the transportation to get it to Valley Forge? Civilians were not going to part with their wagons, their lifeblood, in getting goods to market. Drivers were hard to come by due to the depreciated currency and were known to just dump their cargo in the road and desert without explanation to their superiors. I lay 2 nights in one day and had not a morsel of anything to eat all the time, save half a small pumpkin. Washington did not wait for a higher power to alleviate the crisis. On February 13, 1778, approximately 1,400 men, under the command of Major General Nathaniel Greene, marched out of Valley Forge, with the intent of foraging supplies in the countryside between Schuylkill River and the Brandywine Creek. Though they ran into uncooperative civilians, the meager transportation and supplies it procured extended the life of the Continental Army by vital days. The foraging campaign also confirmed to Washington that Greene was the right man to become the new Quartermaster General. Congress appointed him on March 2, 1778, but Greene objected. Nobody ever heard of a quartermaster in history as or relating to any brilliant action. That's not my words, those are actually Greene's words. But after much convincing by Washington, he accepted the appointment. While the faulty quartermaster commissary system couldn't be remedied overnight, Greene's appointment brought immediate benefits for those encamped at Valley Forge and within the wider army. One of his first actions was to publish a circulatory in pro-patriot newspapers aimed at suppliers jaded by the Mifflin administration. In order to remedy the manifold inconveniences arising from these causes, and, as much as possible, to guard against abuses in future, great care will be taken to engage such persons in the department who are the best adapted to the business of several employments and most likely to preserve a proper deportment and to give satisfaction to the well-disposed part of the community. It will not take long before hard goods such as spades and shovels, held up in warehouses due to want of proper payment, began to trickle into Valley Forge. Foodstuffs soon followed. Though rather than pile it all in camp where it may spoil, Commissary General of Cargo Clement advised Greene to establish depots along critical arteries leading out of camp. Greene's ascension to Quartermaster General resolved the crisis of keeping the army alive for the winter, but ironically enough, you won't find a towering statue of him at Valley Forge today. The largest statue to an individual I've come across at Valley Forge was the Anthony Wayne, who did in fact provide critical intelligence about the region Greene was going to forge, but Wayne was only the deputy general officer on that mission.
I'd like to point out for one moment that Anthony Wayne's monument is looking right over the Pennsylvania Turnpike. He is admiring taxpayer dollars, kind of at work? Question mark. I don't know if he's happy or he's disgusted of what Pennsylvanians have to go through in the 21st century.
A man who does have a prominent statue at Valley Forge today arrived at the cantonment February 23rd, 1778. Flanked by a greyhound and staff officers, this man was introduced to Washington as he had just been introduced to Congress, with a letter of recommendation from Benjamin Franklin hailing him as Baron von Steuben, Lieutenant General in the Prussian Army and apostle to Frederick the Great. That rank was the result of mistranslation and embellishment. Steuben came to the attention of not Franklin, but Silas Deane at a point when the Prussian captain had just lost his position as a small-tier prince's family instructor. As for his acquaintance with the emperor, he had been pressured out of his officers' institute no sooner than he had enrolled. What he did possess was a charisma that cut through the language barrier and captivated anyone who was in his presence. Never before or since have I had such an impression of the ancient fabled god of war as when I looked upon the Baron. He seemed to me a perfect personification of Mars. The trappings of his horse, the enormous holsters of his pistols, his large size, and his strikingly martial aspect all seemed to favor the idea. While Steuben was welcome to America, a history of poor foreign commanders coupled with financial struggles meant Congress could not promise him a high-ranking commission. He came to Valley Forge with the rank of captain, but privately craved the opportunity to show both the Army and Congress his values deserved something higher. Recognizing Steuben's ability to quickly ingrain himself amongst the officers and enlisted men, Washington wanted Steuben as Inspector General. The problem was, in February of 1778, that office was technically maintained by Thomas Conway, but since his appointment, he had done little to alter the discipline of the Army. In fact, because of the cold shoulder Washington's military family had given him, Conway was wintering in Albany, not Valley Forge. In need of improving discipline both on and off the battlefield before the next campaign season, Washington declared Steuben as acting Inspector General, releasing the supposed Baron upon Valley Forge, while Washington navigated the politics of Congress to make the position permanent. In the early morning hours of March 19, 1778, a company of 100 picked men, temporarily assigned to Washington's lifeguard, assembled on a field declared a grand parade for the whole encampment. Starting with the very basic but essential stance of a soldier at attention, Steuben experimented by squad what instructions were most easily met, tweaking or outright cutting certain components of the manuals. The next several days were punctuated by English questioning and Germanic swears. The morning spent teaching a new maneuver. In the afternoons, the Baron schooled the whole model company in their morning lessons. At night, he would deduce what the next day's lessons would need to be based upon prior knowledge of various European doctrines. The Baron sets us a truly noble example. He has undertaken the discipline of the army and shows himself to be a perfect master of it, not only in the grand maneuver, but in every minutia. To see a gentleman dignified with a lieutenant general's commission from the great Prussian monarch condescend with a grace peculiar to himself to take under his direction a squad of 10 or 12 men in capacity of a drill sergeant and induce the officers and men to admire and improve exceedingly fast under his instructions. In truth, Steuben was flying by the seat of his pants and prescribing a formal manual of arms for the Continental Army, but his experiment worked. By the end of the month, he had a company of Continental soldiers capable of moving as a unified body. Washington ordered Steuben's doctrine to be implemented across the entire army. This was achieved by appointing an inspector general for every brigade in camp, where a model squad of 20 would demonstrate the maneuver to captains and other line officers, who were then entrusted to transmit the information to their respective companies. To maintain consistency in the lessons, Steuben was aided by 4 sub-inspectors. It is worth noting that the development of Steuben's doctrine occurred in the face of an increase in the mortality rate at camp. The warmth of spring inflamed diseases that thrived in huts that were several months old and beginning to warp to the elements. Anticipating the damaging effects of smallpox, Washington increased an inoculation program he had already begun to implement the previous winter. But there was only so much that could be done to combat influenza, typhus, dysentery, and typhoid, all of which spread like wildfire across the camp. Approximately 2,000 soldiers would die at Valley Forge, 2/3 of those occurring between March and May of 1778. However, archaeology has yet to reveal evidence of human burials within the camp limits. Most of those deaths occurred at hospitals that were in some cases miles away from the main camp, in part to slow the spread of illness, but also to mitigate panic amongst the army and civilian population. For all the trials the Continental Army endured at Valley Forge, an award of sorts was delivered in the form of a message from Congress in early May. Silas Deane had recently arrived from France to announce a formal alliance had been achieved, promising much-needed manpower, money, and material goods to the American war effort. To celebrate, Washington ordered for his men to assemble for a grand review. On May 6, 1778, the entire army marched in sync upon the grand parade using Steuben's doctrine. A feu de joie followed, a rolling thunder of musketry across the entire length of the line of troops. The process was repeated thrice before the festivities concluded, an impressive accomplishment considering the army was on the verge of starvation a few months earlier. It was also on this day that Washington had the honor of presenting Steuben with a formal commission from Congress for the post of Inspector General, with the rank of Major General. For as heartwarming this occasion was, there was still the lingering question how the Continental Army would measure against the British in the coming campaign. Washington had long anticipated a great battle to regain Philadelphia. Efforts by the Marquis de Lafayette to gather intelligence on what awaited the Americans put a sortie at risk of being surrounded on Barren Hill. Timely communication and an ambush laid by Oneida warriors allowed the sortie to escape mostly unharmed. In truth, there would be no great battle. The fate of Philadelphia had already been decided with France's entry into the Revolution. With war with France now a reality, the British Empire were compelled to redistribute its armed forces across its colonies. William Howe's belief that taking the rebel capital would demoralize the rebels into submission had failed. His replacement, Henry Clinton, organized an evacuation to New York City in June of 1778. On the 17th of that month, Washington called a council of war at the Potts House to determine the best reaction to the withdrawal. After much contention, it was determined to shadow the British across New Jersey, hoping an opportunity may arise to isolate and destroy its rear guard. 2 days later, the Continental Army broke camp at Valley Forge. At that moment in time, there was uncertainty over how far-reaching the tribulations they had endured the past 6 months would have on their bid for independence. They did not know that 5 more years of conflict would occur before that goal was fulfilled. Over the course of the American Revolution, the Continental Army would endure 8 winters, but it was only the winter at Valley Forge that gained immortality. The complex forces of politics and economics which tested the ingenuity and perseverance of men like Washington, Greene, and Steuben morphed into a biblical struggle against the forces of nature that only divine intervention could mitigate. Be it for the truth or the myth, Valley Forge has long been perceived as hallowed ground. Its impact compelled the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to recognize the site as its first state park in 1893. Then, on July 4, 1976, President Gerald Ford signed into law the establishment of Valley Forge National Historical Park. Today, the land that was once the refuge and training grounds for thousands of Continental soldiers is visited by 2 million people per year.